The dust kicked up in plumes beneath the wheels of the mail wagon as Catherine Andrews raced against the setting sun, clutching her shotgun with one hand and the reins with the other. A bullet whistled past her ear, too close for comfort, reminding her that the notorious Wallace Gang didn't care if she was just a mail carrier to them. She was carrying something worth killing for. Socorro, New Mexico Territory, 1879. The frontier town that relied on her deliveries was still miles away, and bandits had her pinned down in the worst stretch of road in the territory. Just as she prepared to return fire, the thunder of approaching hooves caught her attention. Through the settling dust, a familiar silhouette appeared broad-shouldered and determined atop a midnight black stallion. Mason Shaw had arrived, right on time. Catherine had been delivering mail through the New Mexico Territory for nearly 2 years now. At 23, she'd taken over her father's mail route after consumption had claimed him the winter before. The United States Postal Service hadn't been keen on hiring a woman, but there had been no one else willing to brave the dangerous route between Socorro and the outlying settlements. "Behind you," Mason called out as he rode alongside her wagon, drawing his revolver and firing at a bandit attempting to flank them from the ridge. Catherine didn't waste time with gratitude. Not yet. She snapped the reins and urged her horses forward, knowing that their safety depended on outrunning their pursuers. Mason kept pace, his rifle cracking as he provided cover fire. "That's the third ambush this month," Catherine shouted over the thundering of hooves and gunfire. "They're getting bolder, or more desperate," Mason returned, reloading his revolver with practiced ease despite the bouncing of his horse. At 27, Mason Shaw had earned his reputation as one of the most skilled gunslingers in the territory, though he preferred the term security consultant when asked about his profession. The bandits fell back as the terrain opened up, giving Catherine and Mason the advantage of visibility. Only when the sounds of pursuit had faded completely did Catherine slow her team to a more sustainable pace, her heart still pounding in her chest. "You're cutting it mighty close these days, Mr. Shaw," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as the adrenaline slowly ebbed. Mason holstered his revolver and brought his stallion, Thunder, to walk beside her wagon. "I'd never let you face them alone, Miss Andrews, though I must say your shooting's improved considerably. Nearly took that fellow's hat clean off." "Nearly isn't good enough," she replied, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. They had developed this routine over the past 6 months. Catherine would set out on her mail route, and Mason would mysteriously appear whenever trouble arose. At first, she'd resented his help, viewing it as an implication that she couldn't handle herself. But as the attacks grew more frequent and more dangerous, she'd come to appreciate his uncanny timing and deadly aim. "What brings you out to these parts, anyway?" she asked, though she posed the same question every time. "Surely a man with your talents has better things to do than shadow a mail carrier." Mason adjusted his hat, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Just happened to be riding this way. Lucky coincidence." 6 months of lucky coincidences, Catherine observed dryly. The truth, which Mason kept carefully guarded, was that he had been hired by the territorial governor to protect the mail routes after a series of robberies had disrupted communication across New Mexico. What had started as a simple assignment had become something far more complicated, as he'd grown to admire the fiercely independent woman who faced danger with steady nerves and unwavering determination. "Perhaps I enjoy the company," he offered with a hint of a smile. Catherine rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind the gesture. "Well, I suppose I should thank you for the assistance, regardless of your mysterious motives." As they approached Sakaro, the late afternoon sun bathed the modest settlement in golden light. The small town served as a hub for ranchers, miners, and travelers passing through the territory. Its dusty main street housed the essentials: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and of course, the post office where Catherine would deliver her cargo. "Will you be staying in town tonight?" Mason asked, his tone deliberately casual. "I leave again at dawn," Catherine replied. "The eastern settlements are expecting their mail, and I've already been delayed by our friends back there. Then perhaps you'd allow me to buy you supper at the hotel. Seems the least I can do after you provided such entertaining sport today." Catherine couldn't help but laugh. "Most people wouldn't describe being shot at as entertaining sport, Mr. Shaw." "I'm not most people," he responded with a grin that made something flutter in Catherine's chest, a sensation she promptly ignored. "Supper would be welcome," she conceded. "But I warn you, I'll be poor company. These long days in the saddle leave little energy for conversation." "I'll take my chances." As they rode into Sakaro, they drew the usual curious glances. Catherine was something of a local celebrity, the woman mail carrier who braved Bandit country, and Mason's presence beside her had become a topic of speculation among the townspeople. Some wagered on a romantic entanglement, while others suggested he was a government agent or perhaps a bounty hunter using her routes to track wanted men. The reality was both simpler and more complicated than the rumors suggested. After delivering the mail to the small wooden building that served as Sakaro's post office, Catherine headed to the livery stable to tend to her team. She was surprised to find Mason there ahead of her, already unsaddling his stallion. "You needn't help me with my chores," she said, reaching for a brush. "It's not charity, Miss Andrews. It's efficiency. The sooner these animals are tended to, the sooner we can get that supper. I haven't eaten since dawn, and I suspect neither have you." Working together in companionable silence, they finished caring for the horses in half the usual time. Catherine appreciated his help more than she cared to admit. Her shoulders ached from tension, and her hands were raw from gripping the reins so tightly during their escape. The hotel dining room was relatively quiet when they entered. A few travelers occupied tables by the windows, and a land surveyor Catherine recognized was nursing a whiskey at the bar. Mason guided her to a corner table that offered a view of both the door and the street outside, a habit Catherine had noticed early in their acquaintance. He never sat with his back to an entrance. After ordering their meals, venison stew for Catherine and beefsteak for Mason, they settled into the comfortable rhythm of conversation they developed over months of chance encounters. "Any news from the larger world?" Catherine asked, sipping her coffee gratefully. "My passengers are sometimes informative, but just as often filled with nonsense." Mason leaned back in his chair. "They're still building that transcontinental railroad, pushing it further south. Word is it'll reach these parts within a few years." "That will change things," Catherine mused, a note of uncertainty in her voice. "It always does. Progress marches on whether we welcome it or not." Their food arrived, steam rising from the hearty portions. Catherine realized how hungry she was only after taking the first bite, and for several minutes they ate in silence, the simple pleasure of a hot meal after a day of danger bringing its own form of contentment. "There's something you should know," Mason said finally, setting down his fork. His expression had grown serious. "The men who attacked us today weren't ordinary bandits. I recognized one of them used to ride with the Wallace Gang. They're not after the mail, Catherine. They're after something specific, and I fear they believe you're carrying it." Catherine stiffened at his use of her first name. He'd never been so informal before, but the warning in his words took precedence over the breach in etiquette. What could I possibly be carrying that would interest men like that? I transport letters, occasionally small packages, nothing of significant value. Mason's voice dropped lower. There's talk of a gold shipment being arranged through unusual channels. The army doesn't trust the regular routes anymore, not with the increase in robberies. They might be using the mail as cover. Without informing me, Catherine felt her temper rising. They would put me at risk without so much as a warning. It's just rumor at this point, Mason cautioned. But I thought you should be aware. The attacks are becoming too coordinated, too persistent for random banditry. Catherine pushed her plate away, her appetite diminished by this troubling possibility. If you're right, I need to speak with Marshal Wilson. I won't be used as an unwitting decoy. The marshal might not be privy to army business, Mason pointed out. And if this is being kept quiet, confronting officials could alert the wrong people. Then what do you suggest? Catherine demanded, frustration evident in her tone. I can't simply continue as if nothing has changed, not now that I know I might have a target on my back for reasons beyond delivering the mail. Mason reached across the table, his hand coming to rest near hers without quite touching. I suggest you allow me to continue riding with you, but openly this time. No more coincidental appearances. We make it clear you have protection. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Shaw? You've never explained why you take such an interest in my welfare. A moment of silence stretched between them as Mason seemed to weigh his response carefully. Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting to see the mail delivered safely, and you return in one piece. Catherine studied his face, noting the small scar above his right eyebrow, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun, the stubborn set of his jaw. There was something he wasn't telling her, but she'd learned to trust her instincts about people, and those instincts told her that whatever his secrets might be, Mason Shaw was not her enemy. Very well, she agreed finally. We'll try your way. You may accompany me officially, Mr. Shaw. But understand this, I won't be relegated to passenger on my own route. This is my job, my responsibility. I wouldn't dream of interfering with your duties, Miss Andrews, Mason replied, a hint of his earlier smile returning. I'm merely offering an extra gun and an extra pair of eyes. As they finished their meal, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if she was making a wise decision or a terrible mistake. The frontier was no place for blind trust, yet something about Mason Shaw inspired confidence despite his mysterious motives and sudden appearances. Tomorrow's route takes me east toward the mining camps, she informed him as they stepped out onto the hotel's porch. The evening air had cooled considerably, and Catherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I leave at first light. I'll be ready, Mason assured her, his gaze lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary. Try to get some rest, Miss Andrews. Tomorrow promises to be eventful. As Catherine watched him walk toward the livery where he'd taken a room, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a significant turn, whether for better or worse, remained to be seen. The dawn broke clear and cold over Socorro, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Catherine had risen before the sun, checking her wagon and preparing for the day's journey. The eastern route was particularly challenging, winding through canyons and dry riverbeds that provided perfect hiding spots for those with ill intent. True to his word, Mason was waiting when she emerged from the post office with the last of the mail sacks. He sat astride Thunder, leading Catherine's team already hitched to her wagon, his rifle resting across his saddle. You're punctual, Mr. Shaw, she acknowledged with an approving nod. I appreciate that quality in a traveling companion. Military habits die hard, he replied, offering his hand to help her up to the driver's bench. Catherine hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance, noting the strength in his grip as he effortlessly supported her weight. As she settled onto the bench and took up the reins, she glanced at him curiously. "You served." Mason nodded once, his expression revealing little. "Union cavalry. Spent most of the war chasing raiders across Missouri and Kansas." This small piece of his history explained much about his riding skills and comfort with firearms, though Catherine suspected there was more to the story than he was sharing. "My father served as well," she offered. "Came back changed, like so many did. That's why he took up mail carrying, said he needed the solitude after years of too much noise and too many people." "A wise man," Mason commented. "The open country has a way of healing what medicine cannot touch." They set out as the town was just beginning to stir, leaving Socorro behind in favor of the rugged landscape that stretched eastward. For the first hour, they traveled in companionable silence, each scanning the terrain for signs of trouble. "Tell me about your route," Mason said finally. "Who are we delivering to today?" Catherine appreciated his use of we, a small acknowledgement of their partnership that somehow made the lonely trail feel less isolating. "First stop is the Peterson homestead, about 10 miles out. They've been expecting news from their daughter back east. She's having a baby any day now. Then we head to Coppertown, the mining settlement in the foothills. After that, there's a cluster of ranches along the creek before we loop back toward Socorro." "A full day's journey," Mason observed. "And that's if all goes well," Catherine agreed. "Breakdowns, weather, or unwelcome company can add hours." The morning passed uneventfully as they made their way across the territory. At the Peterson homestead, Catherine delivered not only mail but the news that Mrs. Peterson was now a grandmother to twins, a boy and a girl born healthy in Philadelphia. The joy that spread across the older woman's weathered face reminded Catherine why she continued this dangerous work, despite the hardships. Letters connected people across impossible distances, carrying love and hope along with ink and paper. As they approached Coppertown, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged and broken. Mining operations had scarred the hills, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. The settlement itself was little more than a collection of rough buildings centered around the mine entrance, with a company store that doubled as a post office. "I don't like the look of this place," Mason muttered as they drove into town. "Too many idle men watching our approach." Catherine had noticed it too, the unusual number of rough-looking characters loitering outside the saloon, their attention fixed on the mail wagon with unsettling intensity. "The mine's been having troubles," she explained in a low voice. "Rumors of a possible closure. The men are on edge, worried about their livelihoods." "It's not concern I'm reading in their expressions," Mason replied grimly. "Keep the shotgun close while I watch the wagon." Inside the company store, Catherine efficiently sorted the mail for Coppertown's residents, handing it to the clerk who would distribute it later. She was preparing to leave when a burly man blocked her path to the door. "You're the mail lady, ain't you?" he demanded, his breath heavy with whiskey despite the early hour. "I am," Catherine confirmed, keeping her voice steady. "Is there something I can help you with? Word is you're carrying more than letters these days," the man said, stepping closer. "Army payroll, maybe, or mining company gold." "I carry United States mail, sir, nothing more," Catherine responded, her hand drifting toward the small derringer concealed in her pocket. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a schedule to keep." The man made no move to let her pass. "Seems awful convenient. A woman running mail through territory where men fear to travel. Unless she's got protection. Unless she's carrying something worth the risk." Before Catherine could respond, the door swung open behind the miner, revealing Mason's imposing figure, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. The miner sized up Mason, clearly calculating his chances in a confrontation. After a tense moment, he stepped aside with a forced laugh. "No problem, just making conversation with the lady." "Good," Mason replied, "because interfering with a mail carrier is a federal offense. Wouldn't want to see a hardworking man like yourself facing prison over a misunderstanding." Outside, Catherine released the breath she'd been holding. "Thank you for your timely intervention. You seem to be handling it well enough," Mason observed as they returned to the wagon. But sometimes a visible reminder of consequences helps settle uncertain minds. As they drove away from Coppertown, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. That man knew something, or thought he did, about special cargo. "Which confirms my suspicions," Mason said, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Someone's spreading information about valuable shipments, whether true or not. To what purpose? If I'm not actually carrying anything of value, why target me?" Mason's expression darkened. "To create a distraction, perhaps. Draw attention and resources away from the real shipment, or worse, to eliminate the regular mail service altogether." Who would benefit from that? Catherine wondered aloud. Anyone looking to control information or movement through the territory. The mail carries more than personal correspondence. It's government communications, business transactions, news of the outside world. Their conversation was interrupted by the crack of a rifle shot from the ridge above them. Mason reacted instantly, pushing Catherine down as he returned fire. The wagon lurched forward as the horses, startled by the gunfire, broke into a gallop. "Hold on," Catherine shouted, struggling to regain control of the team while staying low. More shots rang out, splintering wood near her head. Mason fired methodically, providing cover as Catherine guided the panicked horses around a bend in the road that would give them temporary shelter from their attackers. 3 men on the ridge, Mason reported tersely. "Well armed and positioned. This wasn't a chance encounter. They were waiting for us." "The ranches are still miles ahead," Catherine said, checking her shotgun. "We're exposed out here." Mason nodded toward a cluster of boulders and scraggly trees about 100 yards off the trail. "There. We can defend that position until they either give up or make a mistake." With no better options, Catherine directed the team toward the natural fortress. They barely reached cover before the attackers appeared on horseback, circling at a distance as they assessed the situation. "You recognize any of them?" Catherine asked, tying off the reins to secure the nervous horses. Mason studied the riders through his field glass. "The one on the left, that's Lee Hansen. Rode with Confederate raiders during the war, turned to robbery after. Dangerous man. And the others?" "Don't know them by sight, but they move like professionals. This isn't their first ambush." Catherine checked her ammunition, a cold determination settling over her. "What do they want? If it's the mail, they could have it and welcome to it. There's nothing worth dying for in those sacks." "I don't think it's that simple anymore," Mason replied grimly. "They've seen my face now. Hansen and I have history, bad blood from years back. This just got personal." Before Catherine could question him further, one of the riders approached, stopping just out of effective shotgun range. "Shaw." The man called out. "Didn't expect to find you playing nursemaid to a mail carrier. Times must be hard for a man of your reputation." Mason's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Hansen? This woman's under federal protection. You're risking a hanging." Hansen laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the open ground. "Federal protection, out here. We both know how much that's worth." He paused, then added, Send out the woman with the mail, Shaw. Our quarrel isn't with her. You can stay and die if that's your preference. Catherine's grip on her shotgun tightened. He's lying, she whispered. They'll kill us both. Without question, Mason agreed. But he's given away something valuable. They want the mail itself, not some phantom gold shipment. Why? Letters aren't worth risking a shootout. Mason was silent for a moment, thinking. Unless there's something specific they're after, something they believe is in your deliveries. Hanson was growing impatient. Last chance, Shaw. Send her out now or we start shooting. Go to hell, Hanson, Mason shouted back. You want the mail? Come and take it. The response was immediate, a volley of gunfire that kicked up dust and fragments of rock around their position. Mason returned fire with precision, forcing the attackers to retreat to a safer distance. We can hold them off, but not indefinitely, he said, reloading quickly. We need a plan that doesn't involve waiting for rescue that won't come. Catherine's mind raced. The mail pouch for the eastern ranches, it's smaller than usual today. Mostly official documents, government communications. She paused as realization dawned. Including sealed orders for the cavalry detachment at Fort Stanton. Mason's expression sharpened with interest. Military orders would be valuable intelligence for certain parties, particularly those looking to avoid army patrols while moving contraband or planning raids. We need to get those documents to their destination, Catherine said firmly, even if we have to abandon the rest. They've got us pinned down and outnumbered, Mason pointed out. And night's still hours away. Catherine glanced at the nervous horses, then back to the mail wagon. They expect us to stay together, defending the wagon. What if we split up? Create a diversion? Mason considered this, clearly reluctant. Too dangerous. I promised to protect you. And you have, Catherine interrupted. But this is my job, my responsibility. Those orders could mean life or death for soldiers and civilians alike. Their debate was cut short as the attackers began a more coordinated approach, using the terrain for cover as they worked their way closer to the defenders' position. We're out of time, Mason muttered. What's your plan? Catherine quickly outlined her idea, a desperate gambit, but perhaps their only chance. Mason listened, his expression growing more concerned with each detail, but he didn't object. It could work, he conceded finally. But the timing has to be perfect, and you'll be taking the greater risk. I know these trails better than anyone, Catherine reminded him. And they'll expect you to have the valuable items, not me. As the attackers closed in, Catherine and Mason prepared to execute their plan. They redistributed ammunition, and Catherine secured the crucial document pouch inside her jacket. Mason would create a diversion with the wagon, drawing the attackers away while Catherine escaped on horseback through a dry creek bed that ran behind their position. If I don't make it to the rendezvous by sundown tomorrow, don't wait, Catherine instructed, checking the cinch on the saddle as Mason helped her prepare one of the team horses for riding. That's not going to happen, Mason replied firmly. I'll find you no matter what. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection deeper than their circumstances or their short acquaintance could explain. Catherine felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with danger. Be careful, Mason, she said softly, using his first name deliberately. He nodded once, his hand briefly covering hers. Ride fast and don't look back, Catherine. I'll keep them busy long enough for you to get clear. With a final glance at the man who had become far more than an unexpected protector, Catherine mounted the horse and prepared for the signal. When Mason fired 3 rapid shots, their agreed-upon sign, she urged her mount forward, keeping low as she raced toward the creek bed and whatever fate awaited her beyond. The dry creek bed provided Catherine with enough cover to make good her escape, though the going was treacherous. Loose stones threatened to trip her horse with every step, and the winding nature of the natural path meant she couldn't build up to a full gallop. Behind her, she could hear sustained gunfire. Mason was putting up a convincing show to keep the attackers occupied. The crack of rifles eventually faded as distance and terrain muffled the sounds of conflict. Catherine pushed on, alternating between swift trotting where the ground allowed and careful navigation of more hazardous stretches. Her mind kept returning to Mason, wondering if he'd managed to escape as planned or if her last glimpse of him would prove to be the final one. Focus, she admonished herself. He survived worse than Lee Hansen, if even half the stories about him are true. By late afternoon, Catherine had put considerable distance between herself and the ambush site. The creek bed had given way to rolling grassland interspersed with juniper and piñon pines. She recognized this area. They were within a few miles of the Lockwood Ranch, one of her regular delivery stops. If she could reach it before dark, she might secure both assistance and a fresh horse. The sun was setting when the ranch buildings came into view, smoke curling invitingly from the main house chimney. Catherine's horse was near exhaustion, its sides heaving with exertion. She'd pushed the animal harder than she liked, but necessity had dictated their pace. As she approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. He relaxed visibly when he recognized her. "Miss Andrews. Good Lord, woman, what's happened to you?" Catherine dismounted stiffly, her legs protesting after hours in the saddle. "Ambushed on the eastern trail, Mr. Lockwood. My wagon and companion," she hesitated, unwilling to voice her fears about Mason's fate. "I managed to get away, but I need to reach Fort Stanton as quickly as possible." Harold Lockwood, a grizzled rancher in his 50s who'd carved his spread out of the wilderness through sheer determination, ushered her toward the house. "Martha," he called to his wife, "put on more coffee and set another plate. We've got Miss Andrews in a state." Inside the comfortable ranch house, Catherine gratefully accepted hot coffee and a plate of stew while explaining her situation to the Lockwoods. She omitted certain details, particularly the nature of the documents she carried, describing them only as important mail that needed to reach its destination urgently. "You can't be thinking of riding out again tonight," Martha Lockwood protested, her motherly concern evident. "You're exhausted, and there's still those men out there looking for you." "I have to," Catherine insisted. "Lives may depend on it." Harold exchanged a look with his wife before nodding decisively. "Then you won't go alone. Our boy Michael can ride with you as far as Fort Stanton. He knows the trails as well as anyone, even at night." Catherine wanted to refuse. She couldn't bear the thought of putting anyone else in danger, but practicality won out. The territory between the ranch and the fort was still bandit country, and having a guide who knew the hidden paths would significantly improve her chances. "I would be grateful for the assistance," she conceded, "but we need to leave within the hour." While Michael Lockwood, the rancher's 19-year-old son, prepared for the journey, Catherine allowed herself a brief rest. She closed her eyes, intending only to gather her strength, but exhaustion claimed her immediately. Images of Mason fighting off Hansen's men flashed behind her eyelids, merging with half-formed dreams until Martha gently shook her awake. "It's time, dear. Michael's ready with the horses." Outside, Catherine found 2 fresh mounts saddled and waiting, along with Michael, a quiet young man with his father's determined jaw and his mother's kind eyes. Harold had provided his son with a Winchester rifle and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. "The northern trail will take you longer but keep you away from the main roads," Harold advised as they prepared to depart. "Michael knows where to cross the river safely, even in the dark. Catherine thanked the Lockwoods for their kindness, promising to return their horse when circumstances allowed. As she and Michael rode away from the ranch, the night closed around them like a protective cloak. The moon, nearly full, provided enough light to navigate without betraying their position too obviously. "Pa says you carry mail all through this territory by yourself," Michael said after they'd been riding for some time. "Is that true, Miss Andrews?" "It is," Catherine confirmed. "Though recently I've had assistance from time to time. Must be lonely work," the young man observed, "and dangerous." "Both," she agreed, "but necessary. When you're carrying the only letter someone's received from their family in months, or news that changes a person's life, it makes the hardships worthwhile." They rode in silence after that, Michael leading them through terrain that would have been challenging even in daylight. The boy clearly knew this land intimately, navigating around treacherous gullies and through stands of trees with confident ease. Catherine found herself grateful for his guidance as fatigue began to dull her own usually sharp sense of direction. Near midnight, they paused to rest the horses beside a small spring. While the animals drank, Catherine checked the document pouch, reassuring herself that it remained secure. The sealed military orders felt like a physical weight against her side, a tangible reminder of her duty. "Something's coming," Michael whispered suddenly, his head tilted as he listened intently to the night. "Riders, at least 2, maybe 3. Catherine immediately doused their small lantern, plunging them into darkness broken only by moonlight. "How far? Can't tell yet. Sound carries strangely out here." They led the horses into a thicket of scrub oak, positioning themselves where they could observe the trail without being easily spotted. Catherine drew her revolver, checking that it was fully loaded. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then, just as Catherine began to wonder if Michael's ears had deceived him, shadowy figures appeared in the distance, 3 riders moving cautiously along the very path they had been following. "They're tracking us," Michael breathed, barely audible. Catherine's heart sank. How had Hanson's men found their trail so quickly? The answer came to her with chilling clarity: they must have forced information from someone. The Lockwoods. No, she and Michael had left too quickly. More likely they had intercepted another traveler who had spotted them on the trail. "We need to circle around them," she whispered. "Get ahead somehow." Michael nodded, pointing to a rocky ridge that ran parallel to their current position. "If we cross that rise, we can cut northeast through Wilson's Canyon. It's rough going, but it'll put us miles ahead of them by dawn." They waited until the riders had passed their hiding spot, then carefully led their horses in the opposite direction, away from the trail and toward the ridge. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to Catherine's strained nerves, but they managed to reach higher ground without detection. The new route Michael chose was punishing a narrow game trail that wound through jagged rocks and dense underbrush. Progress was painfully slow as they picked their way forward in the unreliable moonlight. More than once, Catherine's horse balked at some unseen obstacle, requiring patient coaxing to continue. "We'll reach the canyon before sunrise," Michael assured her during a brief rest. "From there, it's only a few hours to the fort if we can maintain a decent pace." Dawn found them emerging from Wilson's Canyon onto a high plateau that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. In the distance, Catherine could just make out the faint outlines of Fort Stanton's walls, still hours away but tantalizingly visible. "No sign of pursuit," Michael observed, scanning their back trail. "I think we lost them in the canyon." Catherine wasn't so certain. Men like Hanson didn't give up easily, especially with whatever prize they believed the mail contained still beyond their grasp. But she kept her concerns to herself. not wanting to dampen the young man's confidence. They pushed on across the plateau, the terrain now allowing for a faster pace. Catherine's body protested with every hoofbeat, her muscles stiff from hours in the saddle and too little rest. She focused on the horizon, on the fort that represented safety and the completion of her mission. The sun was high overhead when disaster struck. Michael's horse suddenly stumbled, letting out a pained whicker as it favored its right foreleg. They dismounted quickly to examine the injury, a severe strain or possible fracture, impossible to treat in the field. "You'll have to go on alone," Michael said, his expression grim as he assessed the situation. "I'll stay with the horse, try to get him back to the ranch once he's rested." "I can't leave you out here," Catherine protested. "Those men are still searching for me." "You've got no choice, Miss Andrews. That mail needs to get through, and we're still a good 2 hours from the fort at a steady gallop." He patted his rifle. "Don't worry about me. Pa taught me how to take care of myself." Catherine recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Arguing would only waste precious time. She transferred her meager supplies to her own mount and checked her weapons one final time. "Head for that stand of cottonwoods to the west if there's trouble," she instructed, pointing to a distant line of trees that marked a creek bed. "You can defend that position if necessary, and the water will sustain you." Michael nodded. "I'll be fine." "Now go, before those riders pick up our trail again." With a final grateful nod to her young guide, Catherine mounted and urged her horse forward, settling into a ground-eating gallop across the open plateau. The fort grew larger with each passing mile, its promise of safety drawing her onward despite her exhaustion. She was within sight of the fort's main gates when 3 riders crested a hill to her right, moving to intercept her. Even at a distance, she recognized Lee Hanson's distinctive buckskin horse. They had found her after all, making a wide circle to cut her off just short of her destination. Catherine bent low over her horse's neck, asking for more speed from the already tired animal. The fort was so close if she could just reach the open ground where the sentries might spot her. The first shot kicked up dirt several yards to her left. The second came closer, causing her horse to shy and nearly lose its footing. Catherine corrected, keeping the animal on course through sheer determination. "Come on," she urged breathlessly. "Just a little further." The pursuers were gaining, their fresher mounts eating up the distance between them. Catherine drew her revolver, knowing she would have to make a stand soon or be overtaken. Just as she prepared to rein in and face them, a bugle call rang out from the fort. The sentries had spotted the chase unfolding on their doorstep. Moments later, a detachment of cavalry thundered through the gates, racing to intercept the threat. Caught between the approaching soldiers and their quarry, Hanson and his men pulled up sharply, wheeling their mounts around to flee. Catherine nearly wept with relief as blue-uniformed cavalrymen surrounded her, creating a protective barrier between her and danger. The commanding officer, a young lieutenant with a concerned expression, helped her dismount as her legs finally gave way beneath her. "Miss Andrews, the mail carrier?" he asked, supporting her weight easily. "Yes," she managed, reaching for the document pouch. "I have orders from Territorial Command. We were ambushed, my escort." "Easy now," the lieutenant soothed. "You're safe. We'll get you inside and tend to your horse. The documents are secure." As the soldiers escorted her through the fort gates, Catherine cast one last look over her shoulder at the distant figures of Hanson and his men, now disappearing over a ridge. She had succeeded in her mission, but at what cost? The question of Mason's fate still hung heavily in her heart, as fatigue finally overcame her, and the world faded to darkness. Catherine woke in an unfamiliar room, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up quickly, wincing at the protest from her overtaxed muscles. "Whoa there," came a female voice from nearby. "You've earned your rest, Miss Andrews. No need to rush." A middle-aged woman in a simple dress approached the bed, offering a cup of water which Catherine accepted gratefully. "Where am I?" Fort Stanton Infirmary. "I'm Mrs. Talbot, the doctor's wife. You've been asleep for nearly 14 hours." 14 hours. Catherine set the cup down with a clatter. "The mail, did they receive the documents?" Mrs. Talbot smiled reassuringly. "All delivered safely." "The commander was most impressed by your determination. Said it was the fastest those dispatches have ever reached the fort, despite the circumstances." Relief washed over Catherine, followed immediately by renewed concern. "There was a young man, Michael Lockwood. His horse went lame about 2 hours from here. He stayed behind. A patrol found him shortly after they brought you in," Mrs. Talbot explained. "He's fine resting in the enlisted men's quarters. They brought his horse in too, though the poor creature will need time to heal." Catherine sank back against the pillows, processing this good news. But there was still one person unaccounted for, one fate unknown. "Has there been any word from Socorro about what happened to my escort?" Mrs. Talbot's expression softened with sympathy. "No official word yet, my dear. The commander dispatched riders to investigate the ambush site after hearing your story, but they haven't returned." "I need to get back," Catherine said, already pushing aside the blankets. "As soon as possible. The doctor won't clear you to travel before tomorrow at the earliest, Mrs. Talbot cautioned. "And even then you'll need an escort. Those men who attacked you are still out there." Catherine wanted to argue but knew the woman was right. In her current condition, attempting the journey alone would be foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. And if Mason had survived, he would have either returned to Socorro or followed her trail to the fort by now. His absence spoke volumes. "Rest today," Mrs. Talbot advised gently. "Tomorrow we can discuss your return journey. The mail will wait one more day." The remainder of the day passed slowly for Catherine. Despite visits from the fort commander and several curious officers eager to hear her story firsthand, she provided the essential details while omitting anything that might reveal Mason's true purpose or their arrangement. If he was still alive, such information could endanger him further. By evening, Catherine had regained enough strength to join the officers and their wives for dinner in the commander's quarters. She listened politely to their conversation, contributing when expected, but her thoughts remained with Mason and the unanswered questions surrounding his fate. After dinner, she stood on the fort's eastern rampart, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. A cavalry patrol was returning, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats carrying clearly in the evening air. Catherine found herself scanning the riders, searching for a familiar silhouette, despite knowing Mason was unlikely to be among them. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" came a voice beside her. Catherine turned to find Lieutenant James Wilson, the young officer who had led the rescue party the day before. He was a pleasant-faced man, perhaps a few years her junior, with intelligent eyes and an earnest manner. "It is," she agreed. "Though I confess I was watching the patrol rather than the scenery." "Any news?" "Nothing significant," Wilson replied. "No sign of those men who chased you, at least not in our immediate vicinity. We think they've retreated toward the territorial border." Catherine nodded, unsurprised. Hansen was too cunning to linger near an army installation after such a public failure. "The commander mentioned you're anxious to return to Socorro," Wilson continued after a moment. "I'm leading a detachment that way tomorrow morning. We'd be honored to escort you." "Thank you, Lieutenant. I would appreciate the company." Catherine hesitated, then asked the question that had been consuming her thoughts. "Did your men find any sign of Of what happened at the ambush site, my companion, Wilson's expression turned solemn. I'm afraid I don't have definitive answers for you, Miss Andrews. There were signs of a fierce exchange of fire, and the mail wagon was still there, though ransacked. But no. He paused delicately. No remains were found. So he could have escaped, Catherine said, unable to keep the hope from her voice. It's certainly possible, Wilson allowed, especially if he's as capable as you've described. They stood in companionable silence for a time, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. Catherine found Lieutenant Wilson's presence oddly comforting. He asked no probing questions and seemed content to simply provide quiet company during her vigil. "We'll depart at first light," he said finally. "Try to get some rest, Miss Andrews. The journey back will be no less demanding, even with an escort." Catherine nodded her thanks, her gaze still fixed on the darkening horizon and the road that led back to Socorro, back to answers, whether welcome or heartbreaking. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of heat as Catherine joined Lieutenant Wilson and his men in the fort's courtyard. She had been provided with a fresh mount, a sturdy bay gelding with a steady temperament, and her weapons had been cleaned and returned to her. Michael Lockwood would remain at the fort until his horse recovered, then return to his parents' ranch with the next patrol headed that way. The young man approached Catherine as she prepared to depart, his expression earnest. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Andrews, for not leaving me behind when my horse went lame. Many would have." "You risked your life to help me," Catherine replied simply. "I wouldn't forget that. If you see my folks before I get home, tell them I'm fine and eating better than I do on the ranch," he added with a grin. Catherine promised she would, then mounted her horse and took her place beside Lieutenant Wilson at the head of the column. With a brief command from the lieutenant, they rode through the fort gates and onto the trail that would eventually lead them back to Socorro. The journey proceeded without incident through the morning. Wilson had chosen a different route than the one Catherine and Michael had taken, longer but more suitable for a large group of riders, and less likely to provide ambush opportunities for anyone watching the main trails. "We should reach Larson's Creek by midday," Wilson informed her as they rode side by side. "Good water there, and some shade for a brief rest." Catherine nodded, grateful for his consideration. Though she had recovered remarkably well from her ordeal, she still felt the effects of extended time in the saddle and too little proper rest. "May I ask you something, Miss Andrews?" Wilson ventured after they had ridden in silence for some time. "Of course, Lieutenant." "How does a woman come to be carrying mail through the most dangerous territory in New Mexico? It's not exactly a common profession for ladies." Catherine smiled faintly at his diplomatic phrasing. "My father was a mail carrier before me. When he died, there was no one else willing to take the route. The territorial postmaster was desperate enough to give me a chance, despite considerable reservations about my gender. And your family had no objections to such dangerous work." "I have no family left to object," Catherine replied matter-of-factly. "My mother died when I was young, and my father was my only remaining relative. The mail route was his legacy to me, the only way I could support myself independently." Wilson absorbed this with a thoughtful expression. "It must be a lonely life." "At times," she acknowledged, "but there are compensations. I've seen parts of this territory few others ever will. I've met people from every walk of life, and there's a certain satisfaction in knowing I'm providing an essential service." Their conversation was interrupted by a scout riding back from the front of the column, reporting that they were approaching Larson's Creek. Wilson called a halt when they reached the small waterway, allowing the men and horses to refresh themselves in the shade of the cottonwoods that lined its banks. Catherine found a quiet spot somewhat apart from the soldiers, who were boisterously enjoying their brief respite from the saddle. She sat with her back against a tree trunk, closing her eyes as she listened to the soothing sound of flowing water. Her thoughts inevitably returned to Mason. What had happened after she fled the ambush site? Had he managed to escape Hanson's men, or had she left him to face impossible odds alone? The guilt that had been her constant companion since that moment returned with renewed force. "You look troubled," came Wilson's voice, interrupting her dark thoughts. Catherine opened her eyes to find the lieutenant standing nearby, offering a canteen of fresh water. "Just wondering what awaits in Sakaro," she replied, accepting the water gratefully. Wilson settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your companion, Mr. Shaw, was it? He seems to mean a great deal to you." Catherine was startled by the observation, unsure how to respond. Until this moment, she hadn't fully acknowledged the depth of her feelings for Mason, even to herself. Their partnership had begun as one of convenience, perhaps even necessity, but somewhere along the way, it had become something more profound. "He's a good man," she said finally, despite his best efforts to appear otherwise. Wilson smiled at that. "The best ones often hide behind gruff exteriors. My father was the same way, couldn't express sentiment directly to save his life, but would ride 30 miles in a blizzard to bring medicine if someone needed it." "That sounds like Mason," Catherine agreed, a fond smile briefly lighting her features. "He appeared out of nowhere 6 months ago, just as I was being set upon by bandits. Kept showing up after that, always with some flimsy excuse about happening to be riding that way." "A guardian angel in a dusty hat," Wilson observed. "Something like that, though I suspect his reasons were more complicated than simple altruism." Before Wilson could respond, a shout from the perimeter drew their attention. One of the scouts was riding hard toward their position, his expression urgent. "Riders approaching from the west, Lieutenant. Moving fast, at least a dozen." Wilson was on his feet instantly, issuing crisp orders to his men. "Form defensive positions. Carlson, take 3 men and secure the horses. Jackson, get Miss Andrews to cover immediately." The peaceful scene erupted into disciplined activity as soldiers grabbed rifles and moved to predetermined positions. A young corporal appeared at Catherine's side, urging her toward a dense stand of trees that offered better protection than their current location. "Are they bandits?" Catherine asked as they moved quickly through the underbrush. "Can't say for certain yet, madam," the corporal replied, his expression grim. "But friendly travelers don't approach a military patrol at that speed." From their new position, Catherine could see the western approach to the creek, where dust clouds indicated the rapid advance of multiple riders. Wilson had deployed his men with tactical precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that would catch any attackers in a deadly crossfire. The approaching riders slowed as they spotted the soldiers' defensive preparations, halting just beyond effective rifle range. Through swirling dust, Catherine could make out that they were a mixed group, some in civilian clothing, others in what appeared to be fragments of military uniforms. Their leader raised a white cloth attached to a stick, a crude but recognizable flag of truce. "What do you make of it, Lieutenant?" one of the sergeants asked Wilson, who was observing the newcomers through field glasses. "Not sure," Wilson replied cautiously. "Could be genuine, could be a trick." He lowered the glasses, his expression thoughtful. "Keep the men ready, Sergeant. I'll go see what they want." "Sir, regulations state," the sergeant began to protest. "I'm well aware of regulations, Sergeant," Wilson interrupted, "but I'm not sending one of my men out there when I don't know what we're facing." Catherine watched anxiously as Wilson mounted his horse and rode forward slowly, his right hand raised to show he was not threatening the newcomers. The leader of the other group detached from his companions, advancing to meet the lieutenant halfway between the two parties. The conversation was too distant to overhear, but Catherine could see Wilson's posture change from wary to alert, then to something approaching excitement. After several minutes of discussion, both men turned their horses and rode back toward the creek, the rest of the unknown party following at a respectful distance. As they drew nearer, Catherine's heart nearly stopped. Riding beside the apparent leader of the group was a familiar figure on a midnight black stallion, bruised, bandaged, and looking utterly exhausted, but unmistakably alive. Mason. Without thinking, Catherine broke from cover, ignoring the corporal's startled protest as she ran toward the approaching riders. Wilson saw her coming and smiled, gesturing toward Mason with an understanding nod. Mason dismounted somewhat stiffly, handing Thunder's reins to one of his companions as Catherine reached him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both seeming unable to believe the evidence of their own eyes. "You made it to the fort," Mason said finally, his voice rough with fatigue. "I wasn't sure." "And you survived the ambush," Catherine replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I thought Hanson might have." Neither completed their sentence, but the relief in both their expressions spoke volumes. Almost involuntarily, Catherine stepped forward and embraced him, feeling his arms close around her with careful strength, mindful of injuries she couldn't see but sensed were there. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his chest, no longer caring who might witness this display of emotion. "Takes more than a Hanson to finish me," Mason murmured, his chin resting lightly atop her head, though he gave it his best effort. They separated reluctantly as Wilson approached, giving them a moment of privacy before addressing Mason directly. "Mr. Shaw, I understand from Captain Reeves here that we owe you a considerable debt of gratitude." The man who had been riding beside Mason, Captain Reeves, apparently nodded in confirmation. "Shaw here saved my entire detachment from an ambush 2 days ago. We were escorting a gold shipment from the Territorial Treasury when he intercepted us with information about Hanson's gang lying in wait along our planned route." Catherine looked at Mason with dawning comprehension. "You knew about the gold shipment all along. That's why you were so certain I wasn't carrying it. You knew the actual route." Mason had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "I couldn't tell you everything. The fewer people who knew the details, the safer the operation. Hanson had informants throughout the territory." "So you used me as a decoy," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. "Not intentionally," Mason hastened to assure her. "But when Hanson became convinced you were carrying something valuable, it provided an unexpected advantage. His focus on your route meant less scrutiny on the actual shipment." Catherine wasn't certain how to feel about this revelation. On one hand, she understood the strategic necessity. On the other, she couldn't help but wonder if Mason's protection had been merely part of his assignment, rather than born of genuine concern for her welfare. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason added quietly, "My initial orders were simply to observe and report on any threats to the mail routes. Protecting you specifically was a personal choice." Wilson cleared his throat, tactfully interrupting the moment. "We should make camp here for the night. Captain Reeves and his men have been riding hard, and it's clear Mr. Shaw needs medical attention." As the combined forces established a more permanent camp beside the creek, Catherine assisted the detachment's medic in treating Mason's injuries: a bullet graze along his ribs, multiple bruises, and a deep cut on his arm that had been hastily bandaged during his escape. "How did you get away from Hanson?" she asked as the medic cleaned the wound on his arm. Mason winced slightly at the sting of antiseptic. created a diversion with the remaining ammunition, then took advantage of the confusion to slip away through the rocks. They chased me for miles before I managed to lose them in a box canyon. He paused, his expression turning grim. Hansen won't give up easily. He considers this a personal affront now. He chased me all the way to Fort Stanton, Catherine confirmed, nearly caught me at the gates. A flash of genuine anger crossed Mason's features. Damn him! I'd hoped leading him away from your trail would be enough. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. I managed, Catherine replied with a small smile. Had some help from a rancher's son with an excellent sense of direction. Once Mason's wounds were properly dressed, they joined the officers around the main campfire for a simple but hearty meal. The atmosphere was unexpectedly festive. The successful delivery of both the military dispatches and the gold shipment represented a significant victory against the territory's criminal elements. As night deepened and the conversations around them quieted, Catherine found herself sitting beside Mason at the edge of the firelight, both watching the flames in contemplative silence. What happens now? She asked finally. With Hansen still out there and the mail route still vulnerable. Mason studied her face in the flickering light. That depends partly on you, he said carefully. My assignment was to secure the mail routes through the territory, an assignment that's far from complete, but I won't continue shadowing you without your knowledge and consent. You're asking permission to protect me, Catherine clarified, a hint of amusement in her voice. I'm asking permission to ride with you openly, Mason corrected. As your official escort, not just a convenient coincidence when trouble appears. The Postal Service has agreed to fund additional security for key routes, including yours. Catherine considered this proposal, weighing the practical benefits against her fierce independence. And if I refuse, if I prefer to continue alone, then I'll respect your decision, Mason said simply. Though I'd still find myself riding in the same general direction with suspicious frequency. This drew a genuine laugh from Catherine. At least you're honest about it. She sobered, adding, it would be foolish to refuse additional protection, especially given recent events. But I need to know that you understand something important. I'm not giving up control of my route or my deliveries. We would be partners in this arrangement, not protector and protected. Mason nodded solemnly. I wouldn't have it any other way. Your knowledge of the territory and its people is as valuable as my skill with firearms. More so, in many respects. Something in his tone, a warmth that went beyond professional respect, caused Catherine's heartbeat to quicken. Then, I accept your proposal, Mr. Shaw. Though I warn you, the pay is meager and the hours are long. The company compensates for both, he replied softly, his gaze holding hers in the firelight. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but Lieutenant Wilson's approach interrupted whatever might have followed. The young officer apologetically informed them that the combined detachment would depart for Socorro at first light, giving them both ample time to rest before the journey. As Catherine settled into her bedroll later, gazing up at stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky, she reflected on the extraordinary events that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a simple desire to continue her father's work had led her into dangers she could never have anticipated and to a partnership she would never have sought out deliberately. Yet somehow, it felt right, natural even, as if Mason Shaw had been meant to ride beside her all along. The journey to Socorro was uneventful, the combined strength of Wilson's and Reeves' detachments deterring any potential trouble along the way. They arrived late in the afternoon of the following day, the familiar sight of the town's modest buildings bringing a sense of homecoming to Catherine, despite her brief absence. Word of their approach had preceded them, and a small crowd had gathered in the main street to witness the triumphant return of their mail carrier and the military escort accompanying her. Catherine felt somewhat self-conscious at the attention, but Mason rode beside her with an air of calm assurance that helped settle her nerves. Marshal Wilson, no relation to the lieutenant despite sharing a surname, met them outside the sheriff's office, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as he spotted Catherine. "Miss Andrews, when we got word of the ambush, I feared the worst. Good to see you returned safely." His gaze shifted to Mason, his expression turning more measured. "Shaw, seems you've had quite an adventure." "More than I bargained for," Mason acknowledged with a nod of greeting, "but all's well that ends well." The marshal snorted skeptically. "Hanson's still out there, and now he's got a grudge. I wouldn't call that ended by any measure." "A problem for another day," Mason replied easily. "For now, Miss Andrews needs rest and her route needs attention. The mail doesn't stop for bandits or personal vendettas." After a brief report to the marshal about the ambush and subsequent events, Catherine and Mason made their way to the livery stable to see to their horses. The familiar routine of caring for the animals provided a welcome return to normalcy after days of heightened tension and danger. "The postmaster will want a full accounting," Catherine said as she brushed down her borrowed mount. "And there's the matter of replacing the mail wagon and team." "Already arranged," Mason informed her, surprising her once again with his efficiency. "A new wagon will arrive on tomorrow's eastbound stage, courtesy of the Territorial Postal Service. They were most impressed by your dedication to duty." Catherine paused in her brushing. "You seem to have thought of everything." "Not everything," Mason admitted, a hint of uncertainty crossing his features. "For instance, I have no idea where I'm going to stay tonight. The hotel is likely full with all these soldiers in town." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Catherine resumed her brushing, considering her response carefully. "My father's house has a spare room," she said finally, keeping her tone deliberately casual. "Simple accommodations, but clean and private. It would make sense, if we're to be working together, for you to have a more permanent arrangement than the hotel." Mason studied her face, seeming to search for hidden meanings in her offer. "Are you certain? People will talk." "People already talk," Catherine pointed out with a small smile. "I'm a woman doing a man's job in a territory where conventional thinking still reigns supreme. Your presence in my spare room will hardly be the most scandalous thing they've said about me." "Then I accept with gratitude," Mason replied, a warmth in his eyes that sent a curious flutter through Catherine's chest. "Though I insist on contributing to the household expenses. Partners share burdens equally, after all." The Andrews home was a modest structure on the eastern edge of Socorro, set slightly apart from the other residences. Catherine had maintained it meticulously since her father's death, preserving his memory in the well-tended garden and the carefully polished woodwork of the small porch. As she unlocked the front door and ushered Mason inside, Catherine felt a moment of trepidation. No one except herself had crossed this threshold since her father's passing. The house had become her private sanctuary, a place where she could set aside the brave face she showed the world and simply be herself. Mason seemed to sense the significance of the moment, entering with respectful caution and waiting for her cues before proceeding further. "It's a fine home," he said simply, his gaze taking in the modest but comfortable furnishings of the front room. "It suited my father and me well enough," Catherine replied, lighting a lamp against the gathering dusk. "The spare room is this way. It's small, but it has a decent bed and a window that catches the morning breeze." The room in question had once been her father's study, converted to guest accommodations during his final illness when the doctor had needed to stay overnight. Catherine had never had the heart to return it to its original purpose, leaving it ready for visitors who never came, until now. Mason set his saddlebags on the bed, his few possessions making barely an impression on the neatly made surface. "This is more than adequate," he assured her. "I've slept in far worse conditions on many occasions." "I'll prepare something to eat," Catherine said, suddenly aware of the strange intimacy of having Mason in her home. "You're welcome to wash up. There's water and soap on the stand in the kitchen." Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, they began the process of defining their new partnership. Mason shared what he could about his official assignment, explaining that the territorial governor had grown concerned about the increasing frequency of mail robberies and the potential disruption to government communications. They suspected an organized effort rather than opportunistic banditry, he explained. Someone targeting specific shipments based on inside information. "Hansen," Catherine guessed. "He's the muscle, not the brains," Mason replied, shaking his head. "Someone's backing him, providing information and protection. Someone with connections." "Any ideas who?" Mason hesitated, then set down his coffee cup decisively. "Catherine, there's something you should know about me, something that might help explain why I was chosen for this assignment." She waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to reveal. "Before the war, I worked for Alan Pinkerton," Mason said finally. "After my military service, I returned to detective work. The agency sometimes contracts with the government for sensitive investigations, including this one." Catherine absorbed this revelation with surprise but not shock. It explained much about Mason's skills and his unexpected appearances just when trouble threatened. "You're not just a hired gun, then?" "No, though I can certainly play that role when necessary." "And your history with Hansen?" "The captain mentioned bad blood between you." Mason's expression darkened. "I helped put his brother in prison 5 years ago for a stage robbery that left 3 people dead. He swore revenge, but I never thought he'd follow me all the way to New Mexico to get it. So my mail route became entangled in a personal vendetta," Catherine concluded. "No wonder the attacks increased after you appeared." "I'm sorry for that," Mason said quietly. "If I'd realized Hansen was involved, I might have approached things differently." Catherine considered his apology, then shook her head firmly. "You were doing your job just as I was doing mine. Neither of us could have predicted how events would unfold." Relief flickered across Mason's features at her understanding. "Still, it complicates matters going forward. Hansen won't give up easily, not with both professional pride and personal revenge at stake." "Then we'll face him together," Catherine said simply. "2 targets are harder to hit than 1 alone." Mason's expression softened into something Catherine couldn't quite interpret, respect mingled with another emotion that made her heart beat faster. "You're a remarkable woman, Catherine Andrews." The days that followed settled into a new routine. With the arrival of the replacement mail wagon, Catherine resumed her regular delivery schedule, now with Mason riding openly beside her rather than appearing mysteriously when trouble threatened. The arrangement raised eyebrows in Socorro, but Catherine found she cared less about gossip than she once had. Their partnership proved effective from the start. Mason's presence deterred many would-be troublemakers, while Catherine's knowledge of the territory and its inhabitants allowed them to navigate both the physical and social landscape with greater ease than either could have managed alone. Living under the same roof presented its own challenges. Both were fiercely independent people accustomed to solitude, and the sudden proximity required adjustments on both sides. Mason learned not to leave his boots in the middle of the floor where Catherine might trip over them in the dark. Catherine discovered that Mason required absolute quiet in the early morning hours as he planned their day's route over coffee. But there were unexpected pleasures, too. Mason proved to be an excellent cook when given the opportunity, preparing meals on evenings when Catherine returned exhausted from particularly difficult deliveries. Catherine found that Mason enjoyed being read to, a pastime her father had also cherished, and she began sharing favorite books during quiet evenings by the fire. 2 weeks into this new arrangement, they returned from a 3-day journey to the northern settlements, both dusty and weary, but satisfied with the successful completion of their route. As they cared for the horses in the stable behind Catherine's home, Mason broached a subject that had been on his mind. "The Founders' Day celebration is this Saturday," he said, brushing thunder with methodical strokes. "The whole town will be there." Catherine acknowledged noncommittally, checking her mare for signs of saddle sores. "I thought perhaps we might attend," Mason continued, his tone deliberately casual. "Together, that is, if you're not otherwise engaged." Catherine glanced up, surprised by what sounded suspiciously like a social invitation. "You want to go to the dance? With me?" "Unless you'd prefer to go alone or not at all," Mason added quickly, suddenly fascinated by a particular spot on Thunder's coat. A smile tugged at Catherine's lips as she recognized the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his manner. Mason Shaw, the confident detective who faced armed bandits without flinching, was nervous about asking her to a town dance. "I'd be delighted to attend with you," she said simply. "Though I warn you, my dancing skills are rusty at best. It's been years since I've had occasion to use them." Relief and pleasure mingled in Mason's expression. "Mine are likely worse, but I'm willing to risk public humiliation if you are." The Founders' Day celebration was Socorro's most significant social event of the year, commemorating the establishment of the settlement by Spanish colonists centuries earlier. The town square was transformed with lanterns and bunting. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck contributions, and a band of local musicians provided lively tunes for dancing. Catherine spent more time than she cared to admit preparing for the evening, finally settling on her best dress, a deep blue cotton with modest lace trim that had been her mother's. She arranged her hair more carefully than usual, securing it with her mother's silver combs, and even added a touch of rose water behind her ears. Mason's reaction when she emerged from her bedroom made the effort worthwhile. He stood speechless for a moment, his customary composure visibly shaken as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said finally, the simple words carrying more weight than elaborate compliments might have. "Thank you," Catherine replied, feeling unaccountably shy. "You clean up rather well yourself." Indeed, Mason had transformed from the trail-worn gunman to a respectable gentleman for the occasion. His dark suit was well-tailored if somewhat dated, his boots polished to a high shine, and his usually unruly hair tamed into submission. Only the revolver discreetly holstered under his jacket betrayed his true profession, a precaution Catherine understood all too well. They walked to the town square arm in arm, drawing curious glances and not a few knowing smiles from townspeople they passed. By now, most of Socorro had adjusted to the idea of Catherine and Mason as business partners, but their appearance together at a social function suggested a relationship that transcended professional boundaries. The celebration was in full swing when they arrived, with families gathered around tables laden with food, children playing games of tag between the adults, and several couples already dancing to a lively reel. Marshal Wilson nodded to them from his position near the punch bowl, where he kept a watchful eye on proceedings while enjoying the festivities. "Hungry?" Mason asked, guiding Catherine toward the food tables. "Starving," she admitted. "I was too nervous to eat earlier." The confession slipped out before she could consider its implications. Mason's eyes met hers with sudden intensity. "Nervous? About being seen with me?" "No," Catherine replied truthfully. "About whether you'd still want to be seen with me once I put on a dress and tried to act like a proper lady." Mason's expression softened into a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Catherine Andrews, I would be proud to be seen with you if you were wearing a flour sack. The dress is merely a pleasant bonus." The simple sincerity of his words warmed Catherine more than elaborate flattery could have. They filled plates with fried chicken, corn pudding, and fresh bread, finding a quiet corner to enjoy their meal while observing the festivities around them. As the evening progressed, Mason proved true to his word about his dancing abilities, enthusiastic, but somewhat lacking in grace. Catherine found she didn't mind in the slightest. There was something endearing about seeing the usually composed detective counting steps under his breath as he guided her through a waltz. During a break in the music, they stepped away from the dancing area to catch their breath. Mason fetched cups of punch, handing one to Catherine with a rueful smile. "I believe I've thoroughly demonstrated my limitations as a dancer," he observed. "Your feet have my sincere apologies." Catherine laughed, the sound drawing glances from nearby townspeople who rarely saw their reserved male carrier so animated. "You've been a perfect gentleman about it. My father always said the mark of a true gentleman isn't never making mistakes, but how gracefully he recovers from them." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Mason said. "I wish I could have met him." "He would have liked you, I think," Catherine replied thoughtfully, "though he would have subjected you to a thorough interrogation first. He was very protective." "As any father should be," Mason agreed. His expression turned more serious as he added, "Catherine, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Before he could continue, a commotion at the edge of the square interrupted the moment. Raised voices and the sound of breaking glass drew their attention to a disturbance near one of the saloons that bordered the celebration. Marshal Wilson was already moving toward the source of the trouble, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Mason set down his punch cup, his posture instantly alert. "Stay here," he instructed Catherine. "I'm going to see what's happening." "I'm coming with you," she countered, already moving in the same direction. "If there's trouble, 2 guns are better than 1. Mason looked as though he might argue, but something in Catherine's expression dissuaded him. They made their way through the crowd together, reaching the marshal's side just as he confronted the source of the disturbance, 3 rough-looking men who had clearly had too much to drink and were becoming increasingly belligerent. "Evening, Marshal," the largest of the 3 slurred, his hand hovering near a knife sheathed at his belt. "Just enjoying your little town party. No law against that, is there?" "Enjoying is fine," Wilson replied evenly. "Causing trouble isn't. Why don't you boys head back inside the saloon before this goes somewhere none of us wants it to go?" Mason positioned himself slightly behind the marshal, his presence adding silent support to the lawman's authority. Catherine remained at Mason's side, her hand resting inside her reticule where she kept a small derringer, a precaution she never neglected, even at social gatherings. The standoff might have ended peacefully, if not for the arrival of a 4th man, someone Catherine recognized with a chill of apprehension. Though not wearing his distinctive buckskin jacket, there was no mistaking Ellie Hanson's scarred face and cold, calculating eyes. "Well, well," Hanson drawled, his gaze moving from the marshal to Mason and finally to Catherine. Isn't this cozy? The whole happy family out for a night on the town. Mason's posture shifted subtly, positioning himself more directly between Hanson and Catherine. You're a long way from your usual territory, Hanson. Sakura doesn't welcome your kind. My kind, Hanson echoed with mock offense. And what kind would that be, Shaw? The kind that doesn't forget a debt. The kind that finishes what they start. Marshal Wilson intervened before Mason could respond. I don't care what business you think you have here, Hanson. You and your friends are leaving Sakura now, or you're spending the night in my jail. Hanson's laugh held no humor. Always hiding behind a badge, aren't you, Shaw? First the army, then Pinkertons, now the local law, never had the stomach for a fair fight. The taunt was calculated to provoke, but Mason remained outwardly calm, though Catherine could sense the tension radiating from him. There's nothing fair about your idea of fighting, Hanson. Never has been. The standoff continued for several agonizing moments, the celebration around them growing quieter as townspeople became aware of the confrontation. Parents gathered children close, and several men moved discreetly to position themselves where they could assist if violence erupted. Finally, Hanson raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. No need for unpleasantness. We're just passing through, Marshal. Be on our way by morning. His gaze shifted to Catherine, his expression sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Enjoy your evening, Miss Andrews. Pleasant dreams. The threat implicit in his words was unmistakable. As Hanson and his companions retreated toward the saloon, Mason turned to Catherine, his expression grim. We need to leave, now. For once, she didn't argue. The celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by a cold awareness of danger that followed them like a shadow as they made their way back through the square. Marshal Wilson accompanied them, his weathered face set in concerned lines. He's planning something, the lawman said quietly as they walked. Coming into town so openly, making sure you both saw him, it's a message. Or a distraction, Mason replied thoughtfully. Draw attention to himself here while his men prepare something elsewhere. They reached Catherine's house in tense silence. Mason immediately began checking windows and doors, securing the modest dwelling as best he could while Catherine lit lamps in each room. You should stay at the hotel tonight, Marshal Wilson suggested. Harder to approach unnoticed, and I can post a deputy in the lobby. Catherine shook her head firmly. This is my home. I won't be driven from it by threats, veiled or otherwise. At least let me send a deputy to watch the house, Wilson persisted. We'll manage, Mason assured him, but an extra pair of eyes wouldn't hurt. Just make sure whoever you send stays alert. Hanson's men can be persuasive when they want information. After the marshal departed, promising to return at first light to check on them, Catherine and Mason completed their security preparations in practiced coordination. This wasn't the first threat they'd faced together, though it was perhaps the most direct. What do you think he's planning? Catherine asked as they settled in the front room, both too alert for sleep despite the late hour. Mason had removed his suit jacket but kept his revolver close at hand. Could be just intimidation. Let us know he can reach us even here in what should be safety. Or he's planning to burn us out, Mason replied bluntly. It's a tactic he's used before. Set fire to a home or business, then pick off the occupants as they flee the flames. Catherine absorbed this grim possibility with remarkable calm. Then we should prepare for that too. Together, they filled every available container with water and positioned them strategically throughout the house. Catherine gathered important documents and irreplaceable mementos, her father's Bible, her mother's jewelry, the deed to the property into a single bag that could be grabbed quickly if necessary. As they worked, The tension between them shifted into something different, a heightened awareness of each other that transcended their usual partnership. Danger had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only essential truths exposed. When the preparations were complete, they settled into the kitchen at the back of the house, where they could observe both the rear approach and, through the connecting doorway, the front rooms as well. Catherine made fresh coffee, the familiar ritual bringing a small sense of normalcy to the extraordinary circumstances. "I'm sorry our evening was interrupted," Mason said as they sat at the well-worn kitchen table, coffee cups steaming between them. "I had hoped for a more pleasant conclusion to the celebration." "It was lovely while it lasted," Catherine assured him, a small smile softening her features despite their situation. "I can't remember the last time I danced or laughed so much." Mason's hand moved across the table to cover hers, the gesture both protective and tender. "Catherine, before Hanson appeared, I was about to tell you something important." She met his gaze, suddenly breathless with anticipation. "Yes. My official assignment is nearly complete," he said quietly. "The investigation has identified most of the network Hanson was working with, including his financial backers. Within a week, there will be enough evidence to make arrests." Catherine felt her heart constrict painfully. "You're leaving, then?" "My employers expect me to," Mason confirmed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "But I've been considering a change in career. The territorial governor has offered me a position as special marshal, essentially doing what I've been doing, but officially and permanently." Hope flared in Catherine's chest, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "That sounds like a good opportunity. What are you thinking of doing?" Mason's eyes held her steadily. "That depends entirely on whether I have a reason to stay in Sakaro." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings and possibilities. Catherine was acutely aware of Mason's hand holding hers, of the warmth in his gaze, of her own heart beating rapidly against her ribs. "I believe," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that you might find Sakaro has a great deal to recommend it. The climate is agreeable, the people are generally welcoming, and I'm told the local mail carrier makes excellent coffee." A smile slowly transformed Mason's features, the rare, unguarded expression that Catherine had come to treasure. High praise indeed. "Though I must confess, it's not the coffee that tempts me to stay." He leaned across the table, his intention clear in his eyes. Catherine met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with the release of feelings long held in careful check. His hand came up to cradle her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Mason pressed his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you nearly shot my hat off for following you too closely." Catherine laughed softly, remembering their first official meeting 6 months earlier. "I thought you were another bandit. You were very mysterious in those days, Mr. Shaw." "A professional habit I'm trying to break," he admitted, stroking her hair gently. "Secrecy becomes second nature in my line of work, but I don't want secrets between us, Catherine. Not anymore." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Then tell me what's in your heart, Mason." No more professional detachment, no more careful distance. He took both her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "What's in my heart is very simple, though it terrifies me more than facing Hanson and his entire gang. I love you, Catherine Andrews. I think I have almost from the beginning, though I tried to deny it even to myself." Joy swept through Catherine like a physical wave, leaving her momentarily speechless. She squeezed his hands tightly, finding her voice at last. "And I love you, Mason Shaw. despite all my best efforts not to. His smile at her words was worth every danger they had faced, every hardship they had endured. He leaned in to kiss her again, sealing their declaration with a tenderness that promised far more than words could express. Their moment of connection was abruptly shattered by a crash from the front of the house, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames catching. Mason reacted instantly, pulling Catherine away from the table as smoke began to drift into the kitchen. "Back door," he ordered tersely, reaching for his revolver. "Stay low." The front room was already filling with smoke, flames licking up the curtains where a burning torch had been thrown through the window. Catherine grabbed the bag of essentials she had prepared earlier while Mason doused what flames he could reach with one of their water buckets. "It's spreading too quickly," he warned, coughing as smoke thickened around them. "We need to get out now." They made their way to the back door, staying close to the floor where the air remained clearer. Mason checked carefully before opening the door, wary of ambush. The yard beyond appeared empty, but the darkness offered too many hiding places for comfort. "The stable," Catherine suggested, clutching her precious bag. "If we can reach the horses." A shot rang out, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Mason's head. He pulled Catherine back inside, calculating their options rapidly. "They're watching the obvious exits," he said grimly. "We need another way out." Catherine's mind raced, considering the layout of her modest home. The root cellar, it has an outside entrance concealed by the woodpile. Father built it that way deliberately. He said every home should have an escape route. A wise man indeed, Mason approved. "Lead the way." The access to the cellar was in the kitchen pantry, a trapdoor hidden beneath a worn rug. Catherine moved quickly, rolling back the covering to reveal the iron ring that served as a handle. Mason helped her lift the heavy door, revealing narrow wooden steps descending into darkness. "I'll go first," he insisted, retrieving a small lantern from a shelf and lighting it quickly. "Stay close behind me." The cellar was cool and earthy smelling, lined with shelves holding preserved fruits and vegetables from Catherine's garden. At the far end, partially concealed behind a stack of empty crates, was another door, this one leading to an outside entrance that emerged behind the woodpile at the side of the house. They could hear muffled shouts above them as Hanson's men realized their quarry had escaped the burning building. Mason extinguished the lantern before carefully pushing open the exit door, revealing a sliver of night sky beyond. "Wait here," he whispered, slipping through the opening to check for danger. Catherine held her breath, counting the seconds until Mason's hand reached back through the doorway, beckoning her to follow. She emerged into the cool night air, grateful for the woodpile that shielded them from immediate view. The house was now fully engulfed, flames reaching skyward as townspeople began to respond to the emergency. Shouts and running footsteps indicated the marshal, and his deputies were already on scene, adding to the confusion that might cover their escape. "This way," Mason directed, leading Catherine toward the back of the property where the stable stood. "Stay in the shadows." They had nearly reached the stable when a figure loomed suddenly before them, the gleam of a knife visible in the reflected firelight. Hanson had anticipated their move, positioning himself between them and their means of escape. "Predictable as always, Shaw," Hanson sneered, his scarred face demonic in the flickering light. "Always protecting the weak, always thinking you're smarter than everyone else." Mason pushed Catherine behind him, his revolver aimed steadily at Hanson's chest. "It's over, Illy. The marshal and half the town are here. You can't escape this time." "Maybe not," Hanson acknowledged with chilling calm, "but I can make sure you don't either. An eye for an eye, Shaw. You took my brother, I take something of yours." He lunged forward with unexpected speed, knife aimed not at Mason but at Catherine, who had moved slightly to one side. Mason fired, the shot deafening in the confined space between buildings. Hanson staggered but didn't fall, his momentum carrying him forward as Mason threw himself into the man's path. The struggle was brief but violent. Catherine, recovering from her initial shock, searched frantically for a weapon, finding a sturdy piece of firewood near the stable door. As the two men grappled for control of the knife, she brought the makeshift club down with all her strength on Hanson's outstretched arm. The sickening crack of breaking bone was followed by Hanson's howl of pain and rage. The knife clattered to the ground as Mason delivered a final, decisive blow that rendered the outlaw unconscious. "Mason," Catherine cried, noticing the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You're hurt." "Just a scratch," he assured her, though his pallor in the firelight suggested otherwise. "We need to secure him before he comes around." Together, they bound Hanson with rope from the stable, just as Marshal Wilson and several deputies arrived, drawn by the gunshot. The lawman took in the scene with a professional eye, quickly issuing orders for Hanson's removal to the jail and summoning the town doctor for Mason. "Your house is beyond saving, I'm afraid," Wilson informed Catherine as they watched Hanson being dragged away. "Though the bucket brigade might save the stable if the wind holds." Catherine nodded, the reality of her loss beginning to register now that the immediate danger had passed. "At least we got out with what matters most," she said, glancing at Mason, who was submitting with poor grace to the doctor's examination nearby. "Just a flesh wound," Dr. Patterson confirmed after checking Mason's side. "Needs cleaning and stitching, but no serious damage. You were lucky, Shaw." "Skilled," Mason corrected with a ghost of his usual dry humor. "Luck had nothing to do with it." As dawn broke over Socorro, the remnants of Catherine's home smoldered in the morning light. She stood before the ruins, Mason at her side with his arm around her shoulders, both contemplating the destruction and what it meant for their future. "We can rebuild," Mason said quietly. "Better than before, if that's what you want." Catherine leaned into his solid presence, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "What I want," she said with sudden clarity, "is to continue delivering the mail. It's still my father's legacy, still my purpose." "And I'll ride beside you," Mason promised. "Every route, every delivery for as long as you'll have me." She turned to face him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "That might be a very long time, Mr. Shaw. I'm not easily discouraged once I've set my heart on something. Or someone," he suggested, his eyes warming with love and a hint of mischief. "Especially someone," Catherine confirmed, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Though I suppose we should consider more conventional arrangements if we're to continue sharing accommodations." Mason's eyebrows rose in question. "Catherine Andrews, are you proposing marriage to me?" "Would that be terribly improper?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know traditionally the man is expected to." He silenced her with a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings on the matter. "Nothing about our relationship has been traditional from the start," he reminded her when they finally separated. "Why change now? Besides, I was planning to ask you at the Founders' Day celebration before Hanson's interruption." "Then consider it a joint proposal," Catherine suggested with a smile. "Equal partners in this as in all things." "Nothing would make me happier," Mason replied, his expression more contented than she had ever seen it. "Though I insist on providing the ring. A man has his pride after all." The wedding took place 1 month later in Socorro's small church, attended by nearly the entire town. Catherine wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved from the fire in the bag of essentials she had thought to rescue. Mason, resplendent in a new suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such joy that several of the town's more romantic ladies were seen dabbing at their eyes before the ceremony even began. Marshal Wilson stood as Mason's best man, while Martha Lockwood, who had taken Catherine under her wing after the fire, served as matron of honor. Young Michael Lockwood, fully recovered from his adventure, proudly escorted Catherine down the aisle in place of the father she had lost. The reception that followed at the hotel was Soccero's most celebrated social event since the interrupted Founders' Day festivities. The territorial governor himself attended, officially appointing Mason as special marshal for the region and commending Catherine for her exceptional service to the postal system. As the celebration continued around them, the newlyweds slipped away to the hotel's veranda for a moment of privacy. The new house Mason had commissioned was still under construction on Catherine's property, larger and more secure than the original but incorporating salvaged elements to honor the home that had been lost. "Happy, Mrs. Shaw?" Mason asked, his arm encircling her waist as they gazed up at stars appearing in the early evening sky. "Completely," Catherine confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I may still use Andrews professionally. Catherine Shaw, mail carrier, doesn't have quite the same ring to it." "Whatever name you choose, you'll always be the bravest woman I know," Mason said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And the only partner I want riding beside me." "Speaking of riding," Catherine said with a mischievous smile, "the Eastern settlements are expecting their mail on Tuesday." "Think you'll be recovered from the wedding celebrations by then?" Mason laughed, the sound warming Catherine's heart as it always did. "For you, my love, I'll be ready at dawn. Some traditions are worth maintaining after all." And so they were Catherine Andrews delivering mail through what had once been Bandit country. Mason Shaw riding beside her on every route, their partnership in work and life becoming a legend throughout the territory. The mail always went through, no matter the weather or danger, carried by a woman of uncommon courage and protected by the man who had found his heart's true home at her side. In time, they welcomed children who grew up hearing the story of how their parents had met a tale of duty, danger, and a love that had survived fire and bullet to forge something unbreakable. And though Catherine eventually passed her mail route to younger carriers, as railroads and progress transformed the territory, she and Mason remained symbols of a time when courage and conviction had meant everything, and when two people had found in each other the perfect complement to their own strength. Their legacy lived on in the stories told around campfires and family tables of the mail carrier and her steadfast protector, who had loved each other through danger and peace alike, proving that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships are those that endure the longest.